Hello. Lockdown 3. Despite their love of the tiering system, the Tory government was finally obliged to accept that yet another national lockdown would be required as COVID cases bloomed after Christmas 2020. The scientific community was urging people to ignore Johnson's advice that some mingling at Christmas was now permitted by mid-December. This eventually led to the U-turn over the weekend before Christmas, banning festive meetings completely for southern England and restricting them to just Christmas Day elsewhere. Winter was always going to be the most difficult time, with people confined indoors for much longer periods. SAGE and other bodies had been quite clear that, vaccine or no, things had certainly not turned any corner. Lockdown 3 is just another example of the baked-in incompetence of the current Cabinet and Prime Minister. Just as Christmas term ended, Education Secretary Gavin Williamson landed the bombshell of implementing mass testing of pupils on head teachers. This was his policy to keep schools open, no matter what, in the new year. There was no guidance or assistance offered to already stretched staff. It was simply going to happen. Yet by January, the calls to keep schools closed in an effort to contain the pandemic were deafening. However, the government still refused to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation until the evening of the 4th of January. Most pupils had already returned to school that day, Johnson saying at a lunchtime vaccine photo call that, quote, schools were safe, before they suddenly weren't by 6 p.m. The third national lockdown was then announced to commence on the 6th of January, but with schools closing immediately to all but essential workers and the public urged to adhere to the new rules from that evening. You could not make this up. Every time a decision is needed, the Tories and Boris Johnson believe it can be put off with upbeat talk. The Tory party remains wedded to its strategy of going along with Johnson's boosterism and ignoring increasingly strident objections from the science until it is, frankly, too late. The figures in daily briefings as we pass the halfway point of January are a litany of suffering and avoidable deaths, for which there should be no excuses. As of midweek, 20th of January, there were 33,355 daily cases of infection, 37,946 in hospital, and 1,610 deaths. The total death toll in the UK was 91,470. The UK still ranks amongst the highest number of deaths per head of population in the world. Here I must highlight the progress of vaccination. Whilst Johnson, Health Secretary Matt Hancock and so many others are wildly grandstanding over it, the happy reality is that 6.9% of the population already have received their first dose. This is very good news and the one bright point, so far anyway, of this government's performance through 10 months of dealing with the pandemic. I don't wish to detract from progress so far, but we must, of course, remain aware that there could be issues of efficacy, availability, and the duration between shots. Then there is the duration of the immunity they provide, the level of protection against any new strains, who should be vaccinated first, and the general rollout to the wider community. What of those who will not have the jabs for whatever reason? How big a problem might that be? These are questions yet to be resolved. There is some grounds for optimism, but there is also so much about this whole area that medicine is still uncertain of. We can only wait and see and hope as the year progresses. As mentioned in previous chats, The far-right commentators in the British media and many of their wealthy but deranged backers remain adamant that things aren't that bad, that restrictions should be lifted and people should take their chances and smile. One of the more notorious lockdown sceptics, former Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption, is now on record on BBC TV as claiming that some lives are less valuable than others. This is just one example of the sort of person the right-wing press especially likes to laud as voices of reason. It's nice to know where you stand in the eyes of at least some of Britain's political and administrative elite. It explains much. Given that it takes so much of its inspiration from far-right political opinion, the Tories seem hell-bent on trying to get the public to turn on themselves when it comes to blame for the rampant spread of this second spike. Anything to deflect from real scrutiny and assumption of responsibility. Even tighter restrictions are now being called for, yet the government continues to resist certain avenues. Suggestions include banning meeting the one person outside for exercise presently permitted, and another, not apparently followed up yet, to shame the public into avoiding takeaway coffee shops, though without actually compelling those shops to close and thus allowing staff to be furloughed. Shades of pre-lockdown 1 thinking there. I have no evidence to suggest either of those is not a significant vector for the virus, but then I'm sure neither has the government. The measures I mentioned seem to be merely tinkering rather than a genuine effort to control the pandemic. Surveys continue to indicate a resigned but very widespread compliance with lockdown. More official attention surely needs to be focused on businesses still operating when they need not, or insisting staff attend in person when they need not. The government's own DVLA at Swansea has just hit the headlines as a COVID hotspot, with workers in fear of both the virus and workplace reprisals for absence. Why English, but not Scottish, nurseries remain open when primary schools are closed is another obvious inconsistency, as is the revelation that they are not being provided with regular testing despite continuing to operate. People, far from flouting the rules themselves, are now reporting that many workplaces seem able to self-certify as COVID compliant and essential when they are patently not. As last March, there are well-documented instances occurring again where some police officers, and their chiefs, rather overstate the powers handed to them. Given the level of personal fines handed out, it is surely inconsistent that not one company has been prosecuted for any similar failure to comply. Fortunately, Lord Sumption's immediate comments and the wider scientific inaccuracies and misinterpretations on which so many deniers have based their positions have been widely and heavily criticised. Johnson and his cronies, however, remain woefully incapable after 10 months of crisis. The worst possible cabinet in the worst possible government at the worst possible time. Much the same assessment of government capability applies to the wonderful Brexit deal negotiated by Johnson at the last moment, not so much the 11th as 23:58 hours. But that's a chat for part 2.